So we are very lucky to have a couple of brief commentaries on the presentations. First up is Dr. Curran Radel, and would you like to come up here, or would you prefer to stay there?
I can tell.
All right.
Or I'm going to use my computer. Maybe I should stay.
I think you can just... We don't need the logo. That's fine.
Okay. Can everybody hear me? Is that good? Okay. Okay. Let me just turn this up. All right. So we touched a little bit on reproducing the inference that comes from the study. So not just the methodology or how to run the analysis, but the inference itself. And on Twitter, Miguel Hernan from Harvard Biostats posed a question a few weeks ago about whether we should prefer code and comprehensive methods and ditching the discussion altogether from papers. Just not necessarily saying he was for sure for this, but just kind of posing this trade-off. So who should be making the inference from data? Should it be the analysis, the people doing the studies, the greater research community? Is there a trade-off between having papers that allow for more methods, discussion about reproducibility and having the data versus doing inference itself? So that's kind of one of the areas that I would like to hear more about, is just about reproducing inference. So, keep going?
Why don't you go through all
Yeah.
your comments and then we can have a panel respond to
That sounds good. Okay. All right. Oh, I don't have anything. Yeah, no problem. Okay. Okay, so part of the open science movement has been a big push towards the pre-registration of all studies, not just clinical trials. And there's some other prominent epidemiologists who feel that pre-registration could be used against us or against science if there are any deviations from the plan. And I was wondering if there are any thoughts in particular to study pre-registration for different types of epi studies. So for exploratory studies, predictive or causal kind of impact evaluations. How do you feel about pre-registration, and do you think it will be used for kind of a tool of good or used against science? So that same sort of line of discussion that was posed earlier. Another question I had was, what do you think about funding for non-governmental sources like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation or Chan Zuckerberg, for example? So today we spoke mostly about funding from NIH or NSF, but NGOs are playing a bigger and bigger role in providing funding and will likely continue to do so as a small number of people have a lot of money. We know we have cautions about taking money from pharmaceutical companies, or we have sort of conflicts of interest about that, but I haven't heard so much about NGOs. And is there any cautions, or is it a good thing? Is it better than taking money from NIH? What are the feelings about NGOs? And then I have another question about preprints. So preprints allow for pre-publication peer review and for early career researchers to get out their findings quickly without waiting for the journals, and those sometimes very long timelines. But many journals, if you read the language, they dissuade you from preprinting. So how does preprints fit into this discussion? And do they support good science? Because then you can get this pre-publication peer review, or is it actually bad science because the public can read the paper with no peer review, or journalists could latch onto it and say it was a bad analysis, for example. So do we think preprints is a good thing or a bad thing? And maybe some advice for early career researchers and whether they should publish preprints or not. And the last thing I was thinking about is that when you look at kind of journalism today and kind of the blogosphere, a lot of people are really good at producing really excellent data visualizations and kind of running more simplistic models, and they'll do these things and they'll write a big story about it. And the story might involve a lot of causal inference, but kind of no causal methods were followed. And so with more and more of that happening, it seems like a bit of an issue, because it's hard to disentangle, I think, for the public, what studies were done in a causally rigorous way versus those where people do more predictive models or simple analyses and then write a story. So just some comments about that would be really interesting.
So do you mean studies done by the journalists themselves?
Yeah, maybe
not covered by the journalists.
Either by journalists like 538 or, kind of more data visualization storytelling, or done in the blogosphere by bloggers that get a lot of coverage or attention. Okay, that's it. Thanks.
So much, Corinne. Now we have Dr. Jennifer Fishman. Want to come up?
Sure. Well, I had so much to say and so many notes to take that I'm hoping to coalesce them a little bit into some general themes here. As a social scientist and a sociologist of science and medicine, I have to preface all of my comments by saying that they are predicated on the idea that science itself is a human activity and a community-level activity. And I think a lot of what we heard today takes that as a fundamental assumption, but it wasn't actually said out loud. So I wanted to make that clear. And so as a result of that, it is subject to the same fallibilities and politics and dynamics and interactions that we would see in any other levels of social life. And so we see it here in science as well. And I think some of what was brought up is these fallibilities that are part of human life. So we have these standards and norms for science, but we have seen that it doesn't sit outside of social life at all. So as a community level activity then, and in the demonstrated impact and importance of meta-research, I'm wondering how we should think about and consider any given study when taken on its own. So can we ever draw any conclusions about a singular study, or should we draw any conclusions about a singular study? And I was thinking about this given what Dr. Goldman showed about the regression to the mean that we saw, sort of demonstrated right before our eyes, and the difficulties with reproducibility, et cetera. Should we be rethinking science and the scientific enterprise more fully? And this gets to some of what Curran was saying, how we represent science, how we report science. Are we doing, we've done it this way because we've continued to do it this way, we've always done it this way, but should we think about this differently? We have medical journals, is that the best way for us to be reporting science? Especially in light of the idea that it's kind of one by one, one-offs, one at a time. The second thing that I was thinking about is the critics of science. Who are the critics? Who is bringing the message about the problems of science, and who are these messengers? So I was thinking about that actually when Richard was talking about the scientist who was the bad messenger about the HeLa cells, right? So what made him such a bad messenger? What is it about what he was saying or how he was presenting himself that made it fell on deaf ears? And then Dr. Goodman's point about the critiques of science coming from scientists who are outside of that given scientist discipline, right? So the ways in which we will not take kindly when outsiders criticize us. And that's even from other scientists, but those that live in other disciplines. So the defensiveness that exists in defending our own practices. So who are the most appropriate or effective messengers? And then this gets us to the thing that it's the kind of the elephant in the room around the anti-science forces, that when they're the messengers, the so-called anti-science forces. So what do we think about it when they're the messengers about the fallibilities of science or the problems in science? And so what do we make of the fact of when certain people call for scientific reform, we're going to take that to heart, and then when others call for scientific reform or questioning our practices, we are not going to listen to them. Relatedly, this raises the point that the messenger matters, sometimes in part because of their intentions. Right, so this gets back to the granularity, I think, that Dr. Goodman wanted to see when different people are deploying the problems in science for different means. So what does it say about the intentions of the messenger? So even the language that gets used a lot when we talk about the crisis in science around the weaponizing of science, or the weaponizing of the scientific method, that is the weaponizing of transparency or the weaponizing of open science. So the tools of science being used against ourselves in this kind of dual-use technology kind of way makes me think a lot about how we have to think about the intentionalities of those who are using these arguments against us or for us or in science. And it's not something we like to talk about because we like to think of science as standing kind of on its own, right? That the intentions of the scientist doesn't matter, but how do those intentions matter? And then that gets us to the final, I'll raise this other one now because it's coming up, but that makes me think about the incentives, right? So sometimes the intentions matter because of the incentive structure that's built into those people who are producing the science, and who even the incentives for those who want to critique the science. I think that's something that Dr. Goodman brought up a little bit of, that they're kind of given new, that there is kind of a valor now in exposing the problems in science. So that's a really big question for the people in the room here, academics in the room here who are making a living based on the production of science itself. And so changing that incentive structure would require changing a lot of our culture, a lot of our profession, a lot of our security, a lot of our livelihood. Are those sacrifices that we're willing to make in the name of science or in the name of producing better science? And how can we rethink those, or do we want to rethink those? And then finally, I wanted to say something about that was brought up by both Richard and Dr. Goodman as the way out that I would like to hear more about, but I have some questions about, or I have some problems understanding, which is this call for efficiency. Like research efficiency is going to be the way out of all of these problems. And so I want to hear more about that, but I also think that there's some we should think cautiously about that. We've seen efficiency used in lots of ways that are not necessarily to our benefit, but in the past, the rhetoric of efficiency, it's really politically palatable and really, sort of, we can understand how that would be really attractive to policymakers and to funding organizations to think about efficiency. But in the name of what, and I guess I worry that it could just lead to the same problems we're seeing now, that there are ways of deploying that term too in ways that we might not find so agreeable. Okay, that's it.
If anyone on the panel wants to respond to any of the comments, I think you need to turn on the mics.
Mic check. Yeah.
I'll field questions from the floor, but you guys have first crack at any of those.
Well, we could spend 2 hours just responding. I mean, there were so many great questions brought up. So I have thoughts on a lot of them, but I also want to make sure that we get a real interchange here. So I'll just focus on just a very few, and hopefully we'll respond to the others, and other people will. Let's see, papers without discussion. I like Miguel Hernan very much. He's coming to visit us in a few weeks. I think the idea that the science could proceed, or would be best proceeding, by just throwing the data out there and having the community do the work is ridiculous. It's an interesting thought experiment, but the people who are invested and have the most time to do it are the scientists themselves, and data takes deep interpretation. Data does not speak for itself. I mean, so much of what we're talking about, the problem is that 90% of what you do, you can't put in the paper. You have to know your data, you have to know how it was produced, you have to know its errors, and hopefully you make that all transparent. So much of what we're talking about here is a lack of trust that transparency is not, that we're not making it all transparent. We're not telling everybody all the things that affect the inference, with an understanding that 98% of what happens is really going on below the surface. So we can't put the data out there without that knowledge. I think it's it's a sort of Platonic ideal. Also, the death of PubMed Commons tells us that people are just not spending that much time, reading papers and trying to critique them. We got to get on with our lives. So, I don't think that works. It's a nice, preprints is very interesting. All I'll say on that, because I think there's a lot to be said, is I think it's absolutely critical that we distinguish between papers that communicate directly to the public, that are accessible, nutrition, science, therapeutics, versus papers that are primarily communications between researchers. I have no problem with the preprint culture in papers that are communications between researchers. And in fact, I think there was a recent article that looked at the difference between that and the published versions, and they weren't that different. I have tremendous trouble with the idea of preprints, and it's not, I want to point out, it's not peer review. Peer review is often, this magic incantation. It's editors. So the peer reviewers help editors. The reason that a lot of papers are weak, or that the peer review process is weak, is because the editorial structure is weak, and they don't have enough time to spend on it. There's a huge difference between the top journals and when real resources are thrown at it, and the sort of more pocket journals done out of people's, hip pocket. Then you might not see much change, and then you're just getting transmissions from highly variable, peer reviewers. In the top journals, peer reviewers simply are consultants to the editor. So the changes there are substantial. Now, whether they're positive or negative, we could argue. But I'm very worried that we're going to get competing headlines out of the preprints that just appear. I mean, at Annals of Internal Medicine, where I work and have worked for 30 years, if we printed the version that came in, it would be a disaster. And I can't tell you how many times we completely turn things around, usually in the context of dialing back the strength of the inference and putting it in real context. If those were preprints before they were published, we'd get complete chaos. I mean, we're having problems enough these days with one study contradicting another study. Imagine when we're going to get the same study contradicting itself. I'm sure I'm at the back end of history then. I mean, in the sense that, this is going to happen, and my cautions will, it'll have to be played out before it's dialed back. I think I'll just stop talking. I mean, I could talk about many of these. Hopefully they'll all get addressed in the discussion, or I'll pipe up later.
Yeah, and I could do the same, but let me pick up on the preprint thing, which is, I think one of the problems that journalists and scientists share is that a single paper is the coin of the realm, right? And that's a serious problem, both because it creates bad incentives for scientists, and it also creates a warped impression of how science works when journalists say, well, if I'm a blogger and I need to have 5 items a day in my blog, that means that I need to grab for the lowest hanging fruit, which is the results of a single paper. I've been trying to, as a journalist over the years, to move away from that, but it's hard because it's like, well, it's a bite-sized, it's a piece of information I can take and use and report on. But I think with preprints, I think the whole problem gets turned on its head if it's really successful, and all of a sudden tens of thousands of papers could be, I mean, there's 1 million papers a year published in the biomedical literature or something like that. Even if a fraction of them ended up in preprints, I mean, I go and look at bioRxiv from time to time, and I must say, I don't know how to weed through that even to find interesting stuff, right? The way it's going to come to me, honestly, is a PR person in a university is going to pick up on that because the professor is up for tenure, and the professor goes to the PR office and says, I need some, I really want some exposure for this exciting stuff I've got. And so so it's part of this sort of broken ecosystem, and that's where I think where Steve is right to be worried about what sorts of things will emerge from that, because that's kind of crazy. But on the other hand, as a journalist, I mean, I'm supposed to be looking for news, right? So if I wait for the 8th paper that reaches the same conclusion, then that's no longer news, right? So this is a paradox that I'm starting to think about seriously as the world of preprints is growing, and I think that, but it's not just about journalism. It's about this social system, this ecosystem that we all work in, and I think that's not easy to disentangle. I could, in terms of anti-science people weaponizing some of the things that are going on, I think that you can't. I mean, it's like any technology; it can be used for good or ill, right? And I think that you can't necessarily second guess what you want to put out there just on the basis of the fact that somebody might abuse something. On the other hand, I think we need to think deeply about how to respond when that happens, and to find better ways for sorting what is credible and not credible science. And that's hard to do because, honestly, people are, when you talk about who the audience is, the general public is not there reading the scientific literature and thinking about what's true and what's not. They may be reading the newspaper, or more likely, in many of these cases, they aren't even doing that. They're talking to their neighbors and their clergymen or whatever. It's all about these ideas spread through communities that sort of have their own definitions of what they care about, if it's a community of faith or anti-government beliefs or whatever, and everything gets filtered through those notions. So I think the idea that we can just spout out truth, even if I could put the perfect truth out there in my reporting, which of course I can't, then that's only half of the communication. The other half is how it's interpreted, and it's amazing what people will come away with when I'll have one sentence of caveat in a story, and that will be if that's somebody's point of view, that will become the core. See, I knew that was the case, and so I think that the idea that this is a system or communication that we either as journalists or scientists can control is really not really true. It's an interaction, and understanding how the public takes in information, and politicians, how everybody takes in information and deals with it is a huge part of this that is beyond our control.
Can I just pick up on one thing you said, which is, and I'm going to take off on something you've said on the air, which I thought was great, is, you can't wait for the 8th study, but often the study you're looking at is the 8th study. So, and you've said this, that, just force people or ask people what is the research that went on before yours. I have a sort of actually very funny slide, which is on the use of magnets for foot pain, and reported in the New York Times. And the subhead of the report was, this is a study that contradicts many previous studies. And apparently that's what made it newsworthy, but of course if you know how to read it, that's exactly what made it false, and it was false. So you don't, if it's the very first study, then you're sort of stuck. But again, you've said this on the air, if both journalists and scientists, I want to say scientists are, we've done our own, and there have been many other studies of looking at the scientists citing prior work, and it's often miserable. We did one on RCTs, which you'd think would be the ne plus ultra, and these are all studies that we took out of meta-analyses that had 3 to 5 prior randomized controlled trials, and the median number of cited trials was 1, and the actual median number of trials was like 5. And many of these were claiming to be the very first when they obviously were not. And there's a very famous example, the aprotein, which was, was that 60 trials or something, and an amazing number that was actually inspired our work, were not cited, and 40, 50, 60 are going on, and nobody's citing the prior one. So I do think that it is a place where both journalists and scientists need to do a much better job.
Yes, perhaps one point about changing the incentive structure to have better science. There is 2 issues, I think. The first one is that the system is a very complex system with a lot of interaction with universities, researchers, journals, and it's a very complex system. And it's difficult to imagine a better system without any defaults. And we have to be very aware of that. It's easy to discuss the previous system. It's not so easy to imagine the new system. The second point is that I like very much the idea of the analogy with quality of care. in quality of care, we use the Swiss cheese model, with the idea that there is quality of care is a systemic problem. It's not the problem of individuals, it's a systemic problem. And this Swiss cheese model, there is layers of defenses, and when there is holes in the different layers, we have at the end a bad outcome for the patient. And I think it's exactly the same for research. We have layers, but when there is holes in the different layers, at the end, there is a bad outcome that is bad research.
Thank you very much. You guys have all waited very patiently. Now we can open the floor to your comments and questions. I'll just take the questions, and let's start here. Brett? Yeah.
Brett Jones from the Georgia General Hospital in New York. So, take 20 seconds to tell a story, which is so Johnny Hayes was here about 5 years ago now. So we were here, and we're all going around the room and introducing ourselves, and Jim Hamley never told his name. And he kept saying, he said he was a reporter from the Montreal Gazette. He wanted John to tell him what the title was for his story about John's work in science. And so this has been a tremendously nuanced conversation, so we're talking to each other as scientists. But you don't get a headline anymore, you get a tweet, I guess. So, we do have to communicate with others. What's the tweet about today's conversation? What's the bite-sized communication to point out what we tell the public about what's going on here?
I actually reject that. I think it is fabulous to be able to sit down and have a nuanced conversation, and you don't have to boil it down to a tweet. I mean, if I were to write this as a story, I would spend some time thinking about how to synthesize it. But I actually think that the value of this is not that we're coming down to a single pinpoint we can all land on with our 20 other angels. I think it's a broader conversation, and I think I'm going to leave it at that.
Stan?
In terms of the point, I guess, that Steve mentioned in the first presentation about the assaults of trying to get data as a potential delaying tactic, that being an inference, and paralleling it with your role as a statistical editor for the analyst, where you would do you would make similar requests, but presumably with a benign goal.
Although the authors don't often think that delaying by a month is benign, but.
But I was thinking, as this was going on in the analogy back with the NIH Revitalization Act, I think if we go back to the 80s or even the 90s, where there was the focus for subgroup analysis, where the flavor of the day was we have to include more minorities, we have to include women, greater numbers, and Congress was looking at legislation, and I think passed legislation that essentially really imperiled the clinical trial effort if it was interpreted literally. And the way that was dealt with, if I recall correctly, was NIH trials getting together and publishing their interpretation of the legislation. So essentially, they finessed this charge that was being made at their doorstep, which would set back medical research considerably. And I just wonder, is there any possibility of sort of trying to be proactive with some of these attempts to defer and to define things in a way so they potentially are doable and satisfy both of them?
Well, here I want to borrow Jennifer's point. So this is really complicated. It's more political than scientific. Intentions matter. So in a perfect world, in an EPA that was actually about environmental protection, what would happen is you'd have a Congress that would pass this, but then the EPA scientists would interpret it, just like you say, as some FDA scientists also try to make sense of. They don't want to use legislation meant to weaken science. and they can be defenders. But right now, we have an EPA who's doing exactly the opposite. In fact, they're way to the more extreme, and we know that they will do everything, as you saw in the headline I showed, which had nothing to do with science. They're just going to dump the science completely. They disbanded all their advisory committees. So in a setting like that, within the regulatory agency, the answer is no. I mean, the solutions are political. They're not scientific. We don't have allies within the agency who are science proponents. The head is not, and this is beyond where I have special expertise. But you're 100% right. When you have agencies or entities like the NIH that are still operating in a sense in good faith and trying to get the best science out, then what you say is the way things tend to happen. But that's the true danger of what's going on now. Whether scientific criticism or our own rules about transparency are really the driving force of what they're putting forward. It's clearly not. I mean, what they're trying to do is just provide a bureaucratic rationale for getting rid of 90% of the research. Now, the second part of your question, which is, are there ways we can operationalize that to make it positive? I think there's a lot of area for exploration there, and I do think it would be nice if we could figure out, easier ways to make things transparent. And in fact, the scientists I showed, Francesca Dominici and Roger Pang, were providing a model of how to do that. It creates a huge amount of overhead, though, to create accessible data, particularly when you have confidentiality issues, and that's a huge issue, and that's one reason why it's not all going to be available tomorrow. The other thing that shows the bad intentions of the act is, for any one study, these studies are, nationwide, multi-country studies sometimes. To make them publicly accessible and usable can cost a lot of money. You know how much they allocate? It's literally the last sentence to the Honest Act. Total amount of allocation for these purposes, $1 million. The estimate is it would cost over $1 billion. So, I mean, that gives a clue about intentions. I do think this dilemma of how you incorporate intentions, though, is very challenging. Because I don't know the answer to that. I would love to hear others of how to say that a rule in one person's hands is permissible and admirable, in an editor's hands it's okay, and somebody else's hands okay. When we're asking industry, you make it accessible, that's okay, but when they ask us, it's not okay. That's tough, and I really would like to hear, more about that.
Can I pick up on that? And I wanted to get back to something that Curran said when she was talking about NGOs and these mega NGOs now that are some of the biggest funders of scientific research, including the Gates Foundation and others. And when I talk to my students, I give them the metaphor of filters, right? There's the information, and then we rely on certain filters. Medical journals, popular press, blogs, systematic reviews and meta-analyses, some way of taking the completely unmanageable amount of information out there and distilling out of it what you need to make the decisions you need to make, whether they're policy decisions or clinical decisions or patient decisions. And, we keep coming back to sort of the government as a filter and the ability to sort of say, well, the intentions of public agencies tend to be relatively transparent, at least to the extent of who the people are and they were elected on certain political platforms. But many of these other filters, the intentions are much, much more obscure. And I'm wondering, especially things like non-governmental organizations that are completely outside the normal academic sphere or regulatory sphere, who are increasingly the place that could be a real lever for change, but I'm not sure how useful they are. I don't know if you guys have any comments on that.
I could say a couple words about that. I mean, one thing, let's take the Gates Foundation. Well, first of all, let's just look at the order of magnitude here. If you look at the amount of money spent in biomedical research in the U.S., which is what I know the best, a big chunk is actually the drug companies and industry. The NIH, $30 billion, whatever, $34 billion. These other entities are dwarfed and are much smaller, so they're not. I mean, they can have very important leverage in a few specific areas. For example, the Gates Foundation, they have a very specific agenda, and and in many cases, it's an agenda that I think that is socially responsible. It's let's deal with diseases like malaria that have been classically neglected because American taxpayers didn't really. The impression was that they weren't going to fund much malaria research because American taxpayers don't care about malaria; it doesn't affect them, and so on. So I think that in the case of the Gates Foundation, I think what happens is it's not that the science that comes out of there is questionable. It's just it's their priorities up front determine what gets researched, and I think that's not so troubling. Let me give a second example, which is the Chan Zuckerberg initiative, which is also highlights top line scientists and funnels money to them. The trick there is that they are not a charity; they're actually a limited liability corporation, and it's a little bit opaque what their expectations are, but they may be expecting a return on this investment. Maybe they're going to grab the patents that come out of these things. Maybe they're looking at this not as a totally charitable enterprise, which is how it is portrayed, but maybe they actually think that this is a money-making operation for them. And I think to the extent that that's the case, I think we need to be aware of that, and we need to keep an eye on that. And so I think that. We could go down a list of others, but I think those two models, I think, sort of underscore some of the issues that are relevant here.
Perhaps another point about the filtering process for another example, that is clinical trials. Between the clinical study report that is thousands of pages and the final article that is 6 pages or 10 pages, there is a distillation process that is completely opaque. And even for organizations such as Cochrane, we are absolutely unable to deal with thousands of pages for each trial, for example. Therefore, nobody is able to have a look to the clinical study report, except in a very few examples, such as Tamiflu, for example, but it's very infrequent.
And let me put an asterisk, which is that I just realized that the Gates Foundation does fund some of my colleagues at NPR, not me personally, and not my particular work unit. But I just wanted to disclose that.
I want to say one thing about the funding. One idea I've and many people have had is that all of these either foundations, I didn't know about the LLC issue, so that's very interesting. Put aside a little bit of money for basically quality control, whether it's replications or preparation of data for public access or monitoring use of optimal procedures. I will tell you that almost nowhere has there been any uptake of that. We presented 2 proposals to Chan Zuckerberg, which is one of the leaders at Stanford, one through the main leader, who we know quite well, another directly into the office. And we proposed something like 0.5%, 0.25%. I mean, anything. Nothing. No, they said no interest. So that's interesting. Gates, they do have they started emphasizing, the notion of evaluating programs, but it's not always evaluation of their own stuff. So there's huge and powerful incentives or disincentives at every funding body to not, to not show that what they're doing isn't working. Their primary measure of success is just the money they move. And second, and it was very evident at PCORI, where we're trying to still push a strong open science initiative with the understanding that it costs money. This is not, this is a little tax on research. I love the science friction. It's part of the friction. I think you should have used that title, by the way. It was perfect. And there have been some estimates it could cost up to 5% of the cost of a project to do this. And this is not even talking about replications. I mean, that's another planet entirely. And people started having heart attack. It's like that's 5% you're not spending on new research, and you have to justify that to Congress. You have 5% to. They don't see it as necessarily as quality control. That could be like a damage control, or it's saying it's 5% because you're not doing your job well. It can be interpreted in lots of ways, but they're so tight on money that, as was pointed out, the limitations on money are causing some of these problems. To take yet more money out for some of the purposes we talked here is extremely politically challenging. So that's the other difficulty in the system, as well as a lack of appreciation for what the ultimate payoff might be. It could be actually, in terms of efficiency, much more efficient to do it that way than have to do 4 more studies.
Yeah, thanks. So you've talked a lot about some of the ways that we can revamp how we design studies and accept them and publish them. I was wondering if you could comment a little bit on how we train the next generation of scientists to think differently about how science is produced, how facts are produced, how data is produced and analyzed.
You want to start?
Yes, I am not sure to be able to answer, but we are currently funded by the European Community to develop a network that is called Mirror for method in research on research. And in this network, 15 PhD students are funded, and we try to help them to be the next leader in the field of research on research in the future. And we try to help them to be critical and to be innovative in this field.
I'm glad you started. So that we haven't implemented it yet, but that's my dream for what we can do is to, and I proposed it for Stanford, is that we teach students to be, in a sense, the ambassadors within their own discipline. So you don't just sit in a class and say you should do it this way. You teach them to go into their own literature, learn, and this is, I love the pre-bunking. This is like the pre-bunking. You go into their own literature, take the methods that they're being taught that aren't maybe being used that much, optimal methods in their own discipline, and then do, in a sense, be each one a meta-researcher, go into their own discipline and see how much what they consider to be good and bad practices are used, and make this also part of their research portfolio. So they might have 80% in their primary science, but 20% is in making their science better, which of course all methods research is about making science better. Because if we don't actually change the disciplines, I didn't talk about this much today, but this is a battle to be fought on 1,000 fronts, 10,000 fronts. Each discipline, sub-discipline, and sub-sub-discipline, they talk to each other, and they mimic each other. And you can affect pediatric gastroenterology and have no effect on pediatric cardiology. And they mimic their own. They mimic their own studies, and they also do so because that's where the rewards are. So one way to teach is to give them the reward of being able to publish papers within their own discipline, making them. Many of them are passionate and idealistic in ways that their elders are not, and they're very upset. They're also upset because they're shackled, because they feel like if they do, once their eyes are open, if they do what they think is right, they won't get published and they won't get funded. So there are changes happening on many levels. So this cannot be just driven from below. There are changes in the funding, there's changes at the journals, but everybody has to move together. They're like connected by rubber bands. Everybody can move a little bit, and they can move so far until that band breaks. I would say if these changes were not happening at the NSF, were not happening at the NIH, were not happening in all these other places, it would be almost hopeless. You can't train young scientists to commit career suicide, and this is why we perpetuate our methods. But as all these things are happening simultaneously, and there are actually RFPs out for this sort of education, I do think that training them to both empower them, and also they themselves will be changing the disciplines very, very quickly, and you have willingness from the up top, we'll start to see this whole enterprise shift. I also think there's going to be a tectonic break at one point. So there's huge tensions in the system. I liken it to the Me Too movement, so it might seem like inappropriate, but we knew a lot of these practices were wrong for years, wrong, and then all of a sudden, it changes, and collectively we say, "Oh, as a society, we're not going to tolerate this anymore." But it took the acknowledgement of the built-up pressure over years, and I think there's going to be something like that in this domain. There's going to be a lot of slow change in clinical research. We've been working on this for 30 years, but there's also going to be some sort of fracture where the things, non-replication, things that are obvious, that everybody would say, oh yeah, that almost overnight it will shift because we're getting pressures from below and from above. So that's just my hope.
Let me add one little quick thing to that, which is that I was at a meeting recently, and somebody who described a journal club that was grad students and postdocs, I guess, were involved in a journal club, but they, with the twist, which was that they picked a preprint to criticize, to talk about in the journal club, and then a couple of students would then actually write a critique of it and send it to the person who posted the preprint. And apparently, this was a good way to accomplish some of this self-criticism. And the scientists on the receiving end loved it, because then there's like somebody has really carefully undergone, scrutinized their papers, and they've gotten feedback back. So this is an idea that I think it has happened in a couple of universities, I think, but this is an idea I think that could propagate, and I think it's just a fairly simple thing to do that sort of ties together two parts of this conversation, which is like why I couldn't resist mentioning it.
We have two, if you wanted to respond.
Do you see any changes in training earlier than the graduate level and the undergraduate level to rethink how students are taught?
There are some examples of this, but in the end, students at the undergraduate level, they can be taught some of these things, but until they're actually doing them,
And how about as consumers of the science?
Yeah.
I mean, I think we could, but.
There is a program by Ian Chalmers, for example. It's for primary schools. It's called Testing, Treatment, Interactive, and it's to be critical about the way people are testing treatment. And they have done 2 randomized control trials in Africa to help children to understand what is a treatment, how to assess a treatment, and so on. Therefore, you could have that very early in your life.
We have 2 people back there who wanted to respond. I don't know who was
I think
first.
you have 3. You have 1, 2, 3. Right?
Yeah, so start in the back with the red glasses, and then Peter.
About this phase transition that you're talking about,
Yeah.
I'm thinking that one of the key elements is the publishing process. And moving back to what was said, the publishing of research objects like data and software, the whole analysis, right? How do we publish those things? I don't seem to be really visible at that time, because the publishing process is controlled by companies who are vested interest in having that business going on in the same way, at least control that business, which is not entirely aligned with the scientific goals. So, what do you think of the idea of pushing back, and it's happening sometimes, pushing back to the publishing process, to the societies, to the university libraries, such that all those research objects and the vetting of those research objects is going through the societies in a non-profit manner. So I do think that one of the key elements is that there's too much financial interest in for things to change.
I want to make sure everybody gets a chance to get their questions. I think the research enterprise is too big for cottage professional societies, and it's like turning back drug manufacture to the labs and the universities. It's just at a scale that I don't think is realistic to sort of get away. And realistically, we're not going to get away for proper publishers. We should maybe take some of the profit out. I mean, of course, this is such a complex question because the quote unquote open access movement is. There's profit in that too, and it's led to all sorts of abuses. And maybe I'm misunderstanding your proposal.
I'm talking about the societies or universities taking control of the publishing process. Not obviously there could be some companies that go for the process, for sure. But at the moment, if you want to change the way you own or the way Cell publishes, it's not because the publisher is owning the brand and owning the process and those things.
Right. Yeah. One suggestion I heard from Mike Eisen at Berkeley is that instead of having a piece of work judged by the impact factor of the journal where it's published, which is the way it works now, is find a way to attach the impact to the paper itself, and he's been thinking about how to make this happen. And if you can do that, you don't have to dismantle the entire world of for-profit publication, although he would like to, but you can start to break this, this broken, or fix this broken system, because that's, he's there. That's obviously an idea in gestation right now, but I think that he's got some ideas for how to do it on a smaller scale. And if you can propagate that, that at least gets to part of your issue, is that, the control, a lot of this is because, science, nature, and cell tend to have undue influence just because of their impact factors, which is not a good way to structure the system.
We could also imagine to have an index of transparency for researchers. If researchers share their data, share their protocol, share their codes, they have a better index of transparency that could be used without changing the system of journals.
The researchers want to publish. I think they should be publishing those things. Data, the code, should be part of the publishing aspect.
Well, I mean, some of these models do exist. I mean, the faculty, there are lots of journals that have been popped up. I mean, so the question is, can you actually forcibly get rid of the others? I mean, and are they thriving? I think this is I think these are interesting ideas. I think they're incredibly complex in the current ecosystem. There's no, and I also want to point that journals that do make some money, also those that pour those resources back into the editorials, into the editorial process, can actually result in a better journal. So you don't want to starve the publishing industry of resources. You want to sort of right-size it and make sure that there is an undue incentive to, that there aren't journals just like drugs that are so egregiously priced that the entire thing is thrown out of whack. So I think it's going to be a multifaceted solution, if there is any solution to be had, but we'll have to leave that conversation because that's another 3 hours. But it's absolutely the journals, we have to be thinking about them as part of this.
Thanks so much for the discussion. I'm Peter. I'm a medical student from Berlin in Germany. Especially the reflections on the NGOs and money coming from there. I think that's not done often, so that was pretty nice. I'm yet to wait for the Harvey Weinstein of research. That's an interesting comparison. However, I would argue that the Me Too debate it's really clear what to do. Just no tolerance. It's a very black, and not only black and white, but it seems like an easy thing to go forward. It's clear what's wanted. However, our problem is undoubtedly a lot more complex. So there might be more difficulties. That's just the thought that came up. I wanted to pick on what you said. That it's not only journal editors, and journals, I would argue. There was a push from the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors to actually only publish clinical trials with all data available. And it was researchers that refused. And because, some gather the data in years and years, and the notion of just putting it out there, and then having the PhD student in Cambridge, UK, or Cambridge, US, analyze it, would just give away all the credit from it. These researchers pushing it back. And my question, would be, are we missing a blue sky? Are we missing the vision to make a real open science, reproducible future happen? And this is why, for example, other people can basically take the concept of open access or open science and just interpret it in their way and just make it their thing. So are we as a community missing the blue sky? Where we want to go?
The point you made right before that, what was the point you made right before? I want to make sure I address that. Before you got to the blue sky, are we missing the opportunity?
Who's that?
Oh, right, the complexity. That's true. But that's why I said it might only be in one domain that we do it, like replication or open, sharing data. I don't think the whole enterprise is going to be, completely, transformed overnight. But I do think there's certain things that are obvious that may have that moment. The second one, the blue sky. I had a really brilliant thought in my head.
Let me borrow your.
Okay, you started. You probably say.
I actually think that you don't need I mean, you don't need a picture of an absolute ideal. I think it's pretty clear what direction to move in, and you're never going to have a world of science where everything that's published is correct, completely correct, and that's not realistic. It would, I mean, if that were to happen, I would say no one's trying hard enough. So the issue is to look at the avoidable mistakes and the things that can be fixed. Just we already know how to do it, and if you just are moving in that direction. And you reduce the friction. I think that's great. I don't think you need to have a picture of an absolute ideal in order to make really good progress in that direction.
I just remembered. Thank you. Thank you. So I was on an IOM committee on data sharing, and of course this exactly came up. The resistance of the community. The problem there is a failure of imagination, and this may relate to your blue sky. For everyone who would lose a little bit of late stage analysis, and by the way, 90% of almost all the publications come up front, and there's often never a second publication from a trial, so all that is sort of bogus. Those same people who are now losing access to in the third year to their own data now have access to the world's data of lots of studies. So their graduate students now don't have to just go with them, they can go everywhere. So if we look at it through the prism of what we have now, then it's only loss. If we look at it through the prism of what many graduate students could now access for the secondary, tertiary, quaternary analyses, it's much, much greater. And as Philippe said, and as many people are working on, including the NIH, if we give more and more credit for subsequent production of papers from your own data set. So if you get as much credit for publication from the data set as you did from the primary paper, then all of a sudden the incentive is to share the data set. Again, in the current world, you get credit for your own paper, you don't get credit for theirs. But if you get credit for theirs, I'm sending my data everywhere because now there's 100 papers that I didn't have to write. So if we develop a completely different economy of credit and knowledge production, you can imagine that this could happen. All that said, so I do think we're going that place. We could make all data open today, and a lot of this wouldn't change. I just want to keep saying that. Everything could be out there, everything could be transparent, all data could be shared, and we'd still have the same problems if people don't fundamentally know how to do research. So, and they don't want to spend their time checking others' work. There's a few people out there, the meta researchers, but most of the people want to be, creating new knowledge. And they don't have the time. So just like reproducibility is sort of a fuzzy end, we shouldn't mistake open science and transparency as the end in itself. It's a means to an end, and hopefully it will lead to a more better use of data. And if people know that people will look over their shoulder, that could affect things. But fundamentally, we have to develop a workforce that reports the right things, does the right things. Data transparency and openness can help that. I'm certainly behind it in general, but it is not in and of itself the end. In the end, we have to make maximum use of the data we have and analyze them in the right way, produce them and analyze them in the right ways, and we have to teach how to do that.
Perhaps one point more. Technology perhaps will help us also. For example, blockchain technology for clinical trials could be probably helpful with smart contract at the beginning of the trials, and we could also imagine that it will help.
We are just about at time, so I know there are a few people who have their hands up, and I hate to cut off discussion. How long do we have the room for? Until 4? Okay, so I think there are 2 questions over here that we have time to take, unless you want to cede the territory. So over here and over here.
Because you can't really tell what is going on, can't give the context of. You have to listen references, but it's very difficult to find out, how are they connected? Do they always reference people who said the same thing, or, So I was curious if some journals have tried to pick up on this and said, we want to allow the reader to play with this, so that from this perspective, if it's a researcher or a journalist, they can play with it in a way that makes sense to them. I'm assuming that the software is available, but we still have a very traditional form of presenting the research. Can we play with that? That was the question.
The one example I can think of off the top of my head is 538 has had some wonderful interactives where you can basically go in and move some sliders and so on. I think that as a general principle, I think each data set presumably has its own quirks and so on, and I think it would be hard to get one tool that would work for cross disciplines or whatever, or studies. But 538 does have this. 538 does have this interactive, and it does show that you can rather remarkably come up with whatever results you want from a set of data, just depending upon the subtle assumptions you make. But again, that gets back to one of the earlier questions about how much should we trust these data visualizations and so on. And I think that I think the short answer to that is it depends. But because some of them are done with a great deal of thought, but that's the one example that comes to mind.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on all the technology of data presentation. There has been an idea around now for almost 40 years called literate programming, and where you weave the code and the data into the same document, so you can literally change the code and see all the figures repopulate themselves, and also understand how the code and the data and the figures relate to each other. That exists now. And many of the people's names we put up here are champions of that. I think there are many, many more exciting technological ways to think about how we're going to present science. And I think a lot of the informaticians and computer scientists are hard at work on this, and I think there are a ton of models out there that haven't even seen the light of day in biomedical publishing in particular. I think it's a very exciting idea. And I'll look forward to seeing what they do that makes actual headway. That's going to be. I
think it gets back to Philippe's point about interventional research as well. So I'm doing a project where we're just looking at conflict of interest statements in medical literature, and it should be the most straightforward way. All you're saying is this study was funded by someone else. It's totally non-standardized. It's easy. It could be easy to hyperlink to the entity, but no one does this. In fact, many journals, for their conflict of interest declarations, they have a link to a PDF. You have to go to a PDF hosted at a third-party site and mine it for the information you're trying to get. So I think we need to do interventional research where we say, let's present that, and let's present a much easier format and see how well people can do it. And that gets to moving beyond just sort of critiquing it and sort of saying, how do we propose to make it better? But it's not, the technology is not the barrier. It's the impetus.
And I think that there is people who are thinking to personalize the article, because the format is always the same and the needs of the different readers are not the same. Therefore, we could have different format for the different readers based on what their need of their needs.
Okay, final question.
Back to Corinne's question on registration. Should comment on registration of protocols and trials. Not only trials, observation studies as well.
Do you want to?
You can start.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think, and there was I think it's an intriguing idea for preclinical science. I think it would be difficult to have it carried out effectively, just because there's so many. I don't know. I think it sort of depends on how a study came into being. If it started out as an exploratory study or whatever, I think that those would not be pre-registered. But I do think that it is important to note that even the studies that are pre-registered in clinicaltrials.gov, they still go back in and they tweak their registration, what they had pre-registered. And we saw an example of this quite recently in a study where they changed the endpoints at the 11th hour. They'd collected almost all of their data, a big heart study, and then they realized, they weren't really hitting their endpoint, so they went back and then they edited. Of course, the nice thing is you can go back in and you can read the edits and realize that went on. But I mean, it's not a panacea, but it certainly helps if people become suspicious about the fact that an endpoint endpoint all of a sudden miraculously emerges that didn't seem like the obvious primary endpoint to begin with. But I think I don't know. I think it's complicated.
So I was actually on a panel at the Society for Epidemiologic Research on this, and I have a very mixed mind. I think it assumes that pre-declaration and pre-specification, and I'm going to get technical here, has some epistemic meaning. That because you said it before, that means, and you carried through, that means something special about that finding. It means nothing. It literally means nothing, epistemically. That is, in theory, what it is that you would only pre-specify if you had good reason to pre-specify it, and there's good evidence behind that, and that's why you pursue that. That's the sort of chain of logic. That may or may not be true. And sometimes you find something afterwards that links you up to a whole literature that has, you like, oh my God, I didn't even know about this. There it is. So that's a sort of, the idealist talking in the abstract. In the real world, it goes to a lack of trust, because you can solve the problem not by doing that, but by people reporting just what they did. That is, we looked at 17 endpoints. This is the one we found, and I'm not so sure what this means. But of course, they don't do that. And the question is this the right response to that? So will it solve the problem of not being able to know exactly how people came on this relationship? Will it solve the problem of the data mining and the model tweaking? And honestly, even if they pre-specify, it's like, at what level do they pre-specify? A lot of the multiplicity issues come in what's called the garden of forking paths in the model building. Are you going to specify every decision you're going to make, and where you categorize the variables, and where you're going to tweak the model? I mean, how many things are you going to pre-specify? So it's not just about, like in a clinical trial, saying, all-cause mortality is the endpoint. So that's really the challenge particularly in observational research, among the millions of choices that you make. How do you report it in a way that reflects the true uncertainty of the outcome, that's a reflection both of your model choices and maybe the number of endpoints? Will registration solve that? I do think it's a real problem. I do think we underestimate the uncertainty in the conclusions of many observational studies, because there's so much flexibility. Is this part of the solution? We could spend another hour just on that, and then the operationalization of it, even we decided it was the solution, would be unbelievably challenging. The overhead, the science, the tax, the science friction that it would introduce is a lot. So I do think there's a real issue. Whether this is part of the solution, the whole solution, complete distraction from the solution, I'm not sure. But we shouldn't think that pre-registration will necessarily get rid of, solve the whole problem. That's all I'll say.
All right. Unfortunately, I have to be the host, which means I have to conclude the event. I want to say thank you very much to our speakers, our commenters, to Elena Bernier for organizing the whole thing and the incredible amount of work she did behind the scenes, to my co-organizer, Jonathan, to our sponsors, the Class of 70 and the Epidemiology, Biostatistics, and Occupational Health Department, and finally to you guys. I'm amazed that you came and sat through a 3-hour event, which I thought was incredibly stimulating, and a big round of applause to everybody. Thank you very much.